Hello, I'm Shankar.
And I'm Nikhil. This is Chai Across Generations. This is episode 29 Me or We Traditions We Love and the Beauty of Rebellion.
Why the beauty of rebellion, Nikhil?
Well, Shankar, you're just gonna have to listen on to find out, I think.
I mean, I can see it. I always saw myself as a bit of a rebel, but um, would everyone? I don't know. We'll see, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a little bit of an interesting title, so we will see if how much it resonates with everyone else.
Yes, we've been doing a series on individualism versus collectivism since there's such a big difference on these dimensions between South Asian and Western countries. In the first three parts, we've talked about our experiences growing up in individual or collective spaces, privacy, emotional space, and just the challenge of balancing friends and family.
Yeah, Shankar, we've covered a lot of ground, and if you haven't listened to the previous parts and didn't hear Shankar's wise advice about making sure we don't build guilty relationships, you can go back and check out episodes 26 through 28. And hey, even if you haven't heard those episodes, stick around. You can also just jump into this conversation since we cover different topics related to individual versus collective space.
On today's episode, we talk about the idea of tradition and what it means to both of us as first and second generation immigrants. We also chat about a specific tradition we love and why tradition needs rebellion. That may sound counterintuitive, but trust us, there's something there.
There sure is. We'll come back at the end to wrap things up. Here we go. So, Shankar, I wanted to ask you about something.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about individual versus collective.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked a little bit about private space. What I learned from doing my research on individual versus collective is the idea that that's kind of defined at a cultural or national level.
Yeah.
It's really hard to say a specific person is individual or collectivist. We say a culture is individual or collectivist. But what I did find is there are personal values, individual values,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of are similar to that sentiment of individual versus collective.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the value of tradition,
Mm-hmm.
and I define tradition, actually not me, this researcher,
Mm-hmm.
Shalom Schwartz, would define tradition as respect, commitment, or acceptance of customs and ideas
Mm-hmm.
that one's culture and religion provides.
Mm-hmm.
He goes ahead and he looks at that across different countries.
Mm-hmm.
And in his research, South Asian countries are high on tradition.
Mm-hmm.
America, and I think a lot of the other Western countries, are low
Mm.
on that personal value.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the opposite of tradition, he has kind of opposite
Mm.
values in his
Mhm.
work. The opposite value of tradition is hedonism,
Mm-hmm.
which is defined more as pleasure or gratification for oneself.
Mm.
That value is high in American society
Mm-hmm.
and lower in South Asian countries.
Okay.
So I just think it's interesting. We talk about individual versus collective societies, but then when we think of an individual, any one individual can be different.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we think about this idea of tradition
Mm-hmm.
for an individual and the difference between cultures?
So I do agree that these seem to be more personal values. That
Mhm.
much I can definitely agree with. But I'm a little unsure and unclear whether they're really opposites. I do see them as being on a compass, but is it more nuanced than that? Because at some level, if we said, I would rather say non-conformity might be an opposite of tradition, right?
Yeah.
So, but I think that what you're saying in terms of those broad categories and the characterization in South Asian and America are accurate.
Yeah.
I've definitely felt it that when I came to this country that there is definitely not as much respect, commitment, or acceptance of customs and ideas. Um, at some level, the very fabric of Americanism is a culture that's invented recently,
Mm-hmm.
and by the collision and intermingling of different cultures. And historically, if you think about it, probably even when you think of the Puritans landing and their idea of separating themselves from a set of religious beliefs. I mean, in some sense, they're said to have fled religious persecution.
Right.
And that notion of severing oneself from tradition, and the very difference across the pond between America and Europe is based on that. And I think that seems somehow integral to the very fabric of even various other cultures that have since, come into the American experience.
Right.
Hedonism also, and the two by themselves, I'd agree with both those conclusions, but I'm a little more uncomfortable about the exact oppositeness.
That's fair. Yeah. Yeah, they are slightly different and maybe not polar opposites. I could see what you're saying.
Right.
I'm thinking about tradition and how different generations view tradition. So let's say your generation versus my generation, or your generation versus your parents' generation.
Yeah.
How have you seen that play out, if at all?
I think even within generations, I mean, there is so much of the individual take on that. So some people value the customs and the behaviors as constituting tradition. Some may value adherence to a philosophical school as tradition, very abstract. Some may view then a more religious set of practices as tradition. So I think there's a fair amount of distinction even there. Just when you say tradition, what's the broad meaning of it? And your question was whether there is a difference in perception across generations. I think there is. I definitely think there is. So even if we discount for those individual differences, and let's say we take all of those and club them into one generation, I think probably what I would argue is that the second generation here has, for better or for worse, become so unaware of what tradition means to the first generation that they're very challenged to then conceptualize how they may adhere or deviate from it. And so a lot of the deviation is mainly due to ignorance of what the tradition itself is.
Yeah.
And not necessarily through a fault of their own.
Sure. Yeah, where do you think that comes from?
I think uprooting oneself from a community that's rooted in a geographical space is part of it. So if you're in the geographical location where that set of traditions is honored and respected, then it's a lot easier to have access to resources that reinforce that for your children. But sometimes transplants, take a metaphor from gardening or something, or agriculture, a transplanted crop can also become hardy in some ways.
Meaning?
Because it's so. For instance, if you think of us as transplants of a certain tradition into a new country, I would argue that many first generation Indians are so much more sensitive to preserving their traditions that they make very vigorous efforts, perhaps even more than ones in their generation or in India, because there you say it's there it's
right
there, it's
taken for granted.
Right. I think there are pluses and minuses. On the other hand, it may also cause more rebellion against the second generation.
Right.
Where they feel you guys are going bananas about this culture under siege, and just chill out. Right?
Yeah, it's interesting the point you made that the second generation almost needs to know what traditions are from the first generation in order to react to them.
Right.
Is interesting. Because it seems like that conversation should happen, no?
Yeah, you're right, and it doesn't. And I think that's part of the whole assumption. The first generation was brought up in a milieu where that conversation was not needed. Why would my parents have to tell me what the traditions are when we are living it and following it? But now that you have uprooted and transplanted yourself, it becomes vitally important to articulate it.
Right.
And not just say this is how we live.
Yeah.
Because people are going to question, why do you live that way?
Right.
It's so at variance with what we see everyone else do.
Right. Do you think also, when I think of tradition, I think of rebellion. Is rebellion kind of constant during certain stages of life? Meaning, when I'm a teenager,
Mm-hmm.
I was rebelling against some things that my parents thought.
Right.
I'm sure when you were a teenager, you were rebelling against things your parents thought. Like, is that something we should just expect? Is it less a generational effect and more that when you're over the age of 30 or 35 and you're talking to someone who's in their teens, you're always going to be dealing with some rebellion?
I think there's truth to that. And I think rebellion is actually an important force. Because I think if a tradition does not encounter rebellion, it'll become stagnant. And then all the negative practices in that tradition or the negative aspects of it will reinforce and become more crystallized and concrete and harder to break down. So in a positive way and a healthy way, rebellion provides an antidote to a tradition becoming dead and decaying, but stimulates new growth because it forces it to revitalize itself. I think there's value to that. Yeah. If it's in the right way.
Yeah. What are traditions that you say hold fondly or have memories about as you think about different generations?
Oh my gosh, there are so many.
Yeah.
I give you a very simple example. Is the value of the morning bath. It's a tradition that's I think very common in my parents' generation. The notion of going to work without having a morning shower, and I say bath, I mean that in the Indian sense.
Sure,
Sorry,
yeah.
In the US it would be a shower, not like sitting and soaking in a bathtub. But in India, when we say bath, we mean bathing.
Yeah.
So I think that's it's a very simple example of something that's highly valued. Right? You've been to South India. Nobody will come out in the morning and engage in any social activity without having a morning shower.
Yeah.
Typically, would you agree?
Yes, it's unfathomable.
It's it's unthinkable that somebody would do that. But that's not necessarily the way your generation may think.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I agree. It depends. I definitely grew up with the tradition of a morning shower.
Right.
Picked that up from my parents.
Yeah.
Maintained that for a long time. But then there are phases of my life where an evening shower makes more sense. And then as long as I shower that evening, I'm still clean the next morning. Then I shower that evening.
Right.
But I think that would encounter some resistance from an older generation.
Yeah.
Like I see you laughing right now. So how does that sit with you, an evening shower tradition?
Well, to be honest, I'm sure that when I was in college, I may not have obeyed this to a T. And again, that comes back to the point of the rebellion.
Right.
You let the tradition slide, and then I probably had to rediscover them in some way. And I see a great value in it. For me, from every viewpoint, from a spiritual viewpoint, in our traditional and not only traditional, experiential. Water is consciousness. Is a physical form of consciousness. So when you bathe yourself in water, you're literally showering yourself with consciousness. So in a meditative practice, you're trying to, let go of the impurities of the mind and rest in consciousness. So by doing this, you are doing the physical analog of a meditation. And so to me, it refreshes me tremendously. If I'm angry, if I have negative emotions, a shower will cool me down. It makes me calmer, and it prepares me for my prayer or meditation to start the day with a fresh intention. So to me, it's extremely valuable. But that's from my personal experience. I had to maybe go through the rebellion, do my practices, struggle to come to that realization that the wisdom of my ancestors is a true and deep wisdom. But I can't. I can explain it to someone who's interested and maybe invite them to try it. But maybe if I didn't explain it, then people would say, "Oh, what's the big deal?"
Yeah. Wow, I don't think I've encountered this idea of water as consciousness.
Yeah.
Or thought about showers spiritually.
Right. It's there in the Bhagavad Gita, by the way.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Wow. Sri Krishna says, "I am the very essential quality of water." And I know this from personal experience. If I'm really upset, I'll go take a shower. I'll be so much calmer.
Yeah. I agree with you. There are certain, I've definitely had showers that have totally changed my day, right? Like
Right.
in terms of being fresh coming out of them or being inspired,
Mm-hmm.
or like we talk about the idea that strikes you in a shower, right?
Right.
Sometimes I'll have a hard problem, a thorny problem,
Isn't that amazing?
and then in the shower I'll solve it, or even by thinking about something else, something will hit me another way to think about it.
Right.
I never really thought about that as a spiritual time,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, there might be something there.
Yeah. And now, this very thing of cold shower therapy is very popular. You've heard of that?
Yeah.
So the cold shower challenges, and I think there are links to dopamine
Yeah.
regulation
Right.
by this guy, the Stanford neuroscientist.
Huberman?
Huberman
Andrew
stuff.
Huberman?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He talks a lot about, if I remember right,
He does, yeah.
talks a lot about shower. And yeah, I'm saying like, hey, you're discovering the same thing that we knew
Yeah.
for generations.
Yeah. Why is a cold shower better? Do you know?
I actually don't quite. I mean, from the modern, whatever, physiological, biochemical perspective, it has something to do with the way it affects the vascular system, and that changes our biochemistry, is how I understand it. But it's definitely valued in our traditional way of life. Cold over hot.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I don't take many cold showers, I'll be honest. Do you?
I take what I call Scottish showers.
What's that?
Which is you start warm and move it cold because of the thrift, right? You don't want to spend too much money on. With my apologies to our Scottish friends.
Yeah. Is that satisfying though?
Because it's great.
When you go from, isn't it more uncomfortable when you go from hot to cold than just to go to cold right away?
So I think cold gives you a shock.
Yes.
Right. So yeah, and this I feel minimizes the shock. And so I have to share this. So in Costa Rica, where I was recently, one of the big things you'll see on every Airbnb place is no hot water. So they try to be explicit and make you aware that only few places have hot water. And it was a real interesting experience to go back to the idea, just like when we were in India, where you wouldn't always have hot water, for me to re-experience that for 10 days. So I'd go in there, and I still wanted to keep my morning shower. So I'd get out there, turn on the water, and then, I literally worked out which parts of my anatomy could bear the cold water first, and which are the most sensitive. And the most sensitive is your neck and the part of your back between your shoulders. So if you can take cold water there, you can take it anywhere.
You can take it anywhere.
So little experiments and discovery.
That's funny.
I just delight in things like that.
What percentage of your shower is hot versus cold?
Oh, when I'm doing the Scottish?
Yeah.
I think it depends on the weather.
Okay.
So the colder it gets, the later the cold part comes in.
What's the range though? Is it like 10% on, like in certain months?
Almost
or is it
30% is cold.
Okay.
Yeah. And I really enjoyed that.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I typically do not a super hot shower, but a slightly above lukewarm shower.
Right.
And I just do that all the way through.
That's good. Hey.
But I've read a lot about cold showers and cold plunges, and
right.
Like you said, there seems to be a movement toward that.
Yeah. I don't know if I could do the Arctic plunge. That seems like too brutal. Yeah. But there's that also in the Scandinavian countries, like dipping in cold and then running to the sauna.
Yeah. Yeah, and you have it like ice baths for athletes, right?
Right.
It's supposed to help them with recovery.
Right.
So there's a lot of research there. Yeah. Wow. Well, we went from traditions to showers.
Well, there's hedonism somewhere hidden there.
Yeah, that's true. Anything else?
No, I think this was a great conversation, Nikhil.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it, as always.
Yeah.
And it was much more fun because we were in the same room at the same time and you could see each other in the flesh.
Yes.
And react real time. It really makes a difference.
It does make a difference.
Three-dimensional.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah, I like it. It's been wonderful to have this conversation in person.
Mm-hmm.
We get to do more.
I look forward to that.
Yeah. I'm curious too what our listeners think, if they can feel the difference.
Right.
If they like this more than the other format.
Yeah.
Of course, we can't always control if we record it in person, given we live in different cities.
Right.
But yeah, I'd be curious on a re-listen or on a listen if it sounds different.
I wonder if the back and forth is a little more crisp and
I think so. I think there's probably also more interjection.
Mm,
While you're talking, there might be more ums from my end.
absolutely. Feel more
Yeah.
comfortable doing that.
Yeah. And feels more conversational.
Mm,
So, okay.
great.
We learned some things today. Well, thanks, Shankar.
So much fun, Nikhil, as
Yeah.
always.
So that wraps up the final part of our conversation on individualism versus collectivism. Shankar, what are you taking away from the conversation?
Wow. Yes, we did cover a lot of ground. And I think in this one, I really felt that I appreciated the value of rebellion as I grew older and sort of
Hmm.
matured into that. Yeah. And I don't know, what are your thoughts? Did you looking at, tradition versus rebellion and connecting that to the, individual versus collective idea?
Yeah, I think the idea of rebellion as necessary for tradition to exist is fascinating,
Mhm.
and as it was counterintuitive to me when we talked about it on this episode. Um, I think there's so much to be learned there. Like, we often assume that compliance is the best thing, and yes, in a lot of cases it probably is. But to have the, I don't know, to give the space
Mhm.
for rebellion, some rebellion might actually just be evolution or growth, right?
Right.
So that was, I think that was a really powerful moment.
Mhm. Thanks. And I'm glad you gave that nuance because rebellion for the sake of advancing, say, a higher cause or finding the truth or holding ourselves to a certain consistency, I think that's really growth stimulating. But of course, they can
Right,
also just be rebellion for the sake of it, which may not, be that productive. Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's well said. And I wonder how a message like that is received by different generations. Like, if I was a parent, that might be a little bit harder for me to receive.
Mhm.
Or maybe not. I don't know.
Right. I think if the intent and the spirit of the questioning of tradition is
Right.
truly coming from a place of, you know, positive drive towards the truth, towards consistency, then I think, you know, people shouldn't have a problem with it. Although I'm sure, I'm sure many will. Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Uh, Go ahead.
No, I was just kind of curious to see what else you're taking away.
Yeah. I I'm thinking about this idea of water as consciousness that
Mhm.
you brought up. It's very beautifully said. It's spiritual to have a bath or a shower. Um, it also made me think about a couple of movies that came out recently. For example, Avatar: The Way of Water,
Yeah,
last December, which made so much money. It's a part of that movie is about the spirituality of water, the way of water,
right.
and I don't know if I really appreciated it um, until you had mentioned it. So I think I'm going to enjoy my next few showers tremendously, and maybe think about that space as a bit of a spiritual, right, or reflective space.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Actually, I'm glad you made the connection to that. Uh, kind of topical, right? It's lovely because a lot of people might have seen that and it resonates with them, right?
Right. Yeah, and
Yeah.
you see that same theme in so many different cultures. So I think it speaks to maybe a more universal truth than just a South Asian perspective. And I think that's when I feel most powerful in our conversations, when we stumble upon something that actually ties to other things or other the way other cultures see things and that I've witnessed before in those cultures.
Yeah, it's almost like one of those universals or archetypes, right?
Right.
The notion of
Yeah, exactly.
an unbroken thread or an unbroken stream, whether it
Yeah.
be consciousness or water.
Right. Yeah. And speaking of universals, Shankar, our dear listeners can still and can always reach us on our Instagram page, Chai Across Generations, or on our email at chaiacrossgenerations@gmail.com.
As always, subscribe to our podcast and please leave us a rating or review on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. This really, really helps new people find our show, and we want to thank you all for listening.
See you all next time.